Gentrification usually has a negative connotation. Hipster coffee shops, rent increases, displacement, homelessness are all typically associated with gentrification. But it doesn't have to be this way.
Right now, I'm in the city of Leipzig, Germany. More specifically, the neighborhood of Plagwitz. Plagwitz. We'll go with that for this. I'm not really the best at pronouncing German words, so I'm going to stick with the best pronunciation I can. You can correct me if you really like. But anyway, it's a neighborhood full of restaurants and cafes and beautiful little shops, green space and art studios. Most importantly, tons of graffiti. It's become a real hipster community. It's very artsy, it's very up and coming, very eccentric, but it wasn't always like this.
In the former East Germany, Leipzig was a major industrial hub. Centrally located, its hundreds of factories employed hundreds of thousands of people. That was until protests which began in Leipzig brought down the Berlin Wall and an end to the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany as most of us know it.
Now what ended up happening at that time was tons of young people basically left the city, and there was this mass exodus of people. The city at one point had over 600,000 people and eventually reduced down to 430,000 people. They actually ended up losing 90% of their industry jobs.
This created abandoned homes, shops, and factories. During this time of rapid change and newfound freedoms, a graffiti culture was developing. You could draw a lot of comparisons to the 1960s counterculture movement in America. This concoction created places like Graffiti Alley.
See, nobody knows exactly how or when or where or why this graffiti culture developed, but it did. And at the exact same time, Leipzig knew it needed to start to rebuild and rethink its whole idea for its city if it wanted to actually be a thriving city again. Over the next 20 or 30 years, they decided to rebuild and repurpose their city and keep a few goals in mind. These goals were to keep what they could and tear down what they must. At the same time, making sure that housing was still affordable for the average person. And then finally, they wanted to make sure that there was a diversity in the buildings in terms of having lots of green space and shops sprinkled throughout all their residential communities.
And for the most part, they succeeded. Let me show you. This is all the restaurants in Plagwitz. It's not like they're all concentrated in one single street like you would see in most cities, which to me means they succeeded in diversifying their zoning. On the affordability side of things, it's a little bit trickier because of the recent inflation, but even then, these rents are still relatively affordable. And finally, the repurposing is the real success here. This is a warehouse converted into a grocery store and lunch spot. But the place that started all of this was this cotton factory. This was converted into an art space, which we'll get into in a minute.
Where does the graffiti fit into all of this? Well, as the graffiti culture was developing, Leipzig was in the same time of rapid change. Things were extremely cheap. A lot of artists, a lot of collectives, a lot of businesses bought up this cheap land, this cheap space, and rented it out to various artists or just allowed people to create street art.
And that's where this old cotton factory comes into play. It was purchased in the 90s and converted into art galleries, art studios, theaters, and concert halls.
With all this, an illegal activity actually kind of became legal. Not literally legal, but they now had a legal space to paint and to create art. And a lot of these buildings that were owned by collectives, such as Graffiti Alley there, they would hold things like raves and parties and concerts of all sorts. Those were also illegal or on the bare minimum in a gray zone. Rather than shutting them down as the city probably could have, they decided better of it. Instead, leaned towards an approach of acceptance. And that's one of those things that makes this city and this area specifically an example for gentrification for North America and, to be honest, the rest of the world as well. So first, let me tell you a little bit of a story. I grew up in a city just like this, Hamilton, Ontario. Once an old thriving steel town, now no longer. Hamilton went through a very similar thing that Leipzig did. It had industry dry up in a fairly rapid amount of time, leaving a lot less jobs. A lot of people flee the city. unfortunately, that caused a lot of the other small businesses to end up closing down as well. Even though they weren't directly related to the steel industry, they were funded by, people who had money that worked at those steel mills. This has created a city that is now a shadow of its former self, and in a lot of ways needs to gentrify.
Hamilton's gentrification has gone over in the typical fashion. As Toronto became unaffordable, many people from the city came to the cheaper Hamilton. Lots of the houses were torn down or renovated. Many old industrial buildings and low-income housing was demolished to be replaced with high-rise condos. This caused the same displacement and homelessness mentioned earlier, due to the new places being much more expensive, which leads me into the first point.
Cities need to come up with a plan. Back in the 90s, as I said, they came up with a major plan. They said, we're not going to demolish old buildings unless we have to. We're going to allow some of this creative freedom. We're going to revitalize and try to attract new people.
I forgot to mention the part of the plan that kept things affordable, because by focusing on this, it reduces some of the impacts of gentrification.
That's what many North American cities need to do. They need to come up with one plan, not something that necessarily just makes them look good either. And I'll give another example within Hamilton. There they want to build an LRT, a tram essentially, which would move people from one end of the city to the other. It is a $1 billion project for a city of 600,000 people that frankly does not have a traffic issue, that does not necessarily have a need for this. If people were going to take transit, there's already a bus that runs the exact same direction. So instead of using that money for something like that, they could potentially use the money to revitalize the city.
Which leads me into the next point. Let's remove the red tape and get creative.
Look at, Italy. A lot of towns there that struggled with similar mass exoduses. Now what are they doing? They're selling properties for $1. $1. But with the condition that you have to rebuild it. In Hamilton, there's so much red tape around a lot of old buildings. They have tons and tons of old buildings just like this. But in order to actually convert them into anything, it requires so many permits, so much regulation, that nothing can actually be accomplished. The more red tape that you put in front of people, the more they'll try to work around it, the more they'll try to get away from it. Especially developers don't want to commit millions and millions of dollars on projects that aren't going to go anywhere or just are much less profitable. It's an unfortunate fact about capitalism. So I guess the lesson that can be learned here in Leipzig that can be applied to other cities in North America, such as Hamilton or Detroit or Pittsburgh or other places where they've really seen industry dry up and crumble, is remove a lot of this red tape and people will do it themselves. They'll figure it out. Allow zoning to be changed, allow a different outlook on it, and allow people to do what they see fit. This has really helped turn this area around. Completely turn it around. This is now almost one of the cultural hubs of the city, and it's not a very large city. It's only 600,000 people or so, which you'll note is actually back to the same population that it was before the mass exodus in the 90s. A lot of these cities, they hide behind capitalism as the excuse, and it's a freaking terrible excuse, because yes, somebody owns these properties, they own these buildings, but there's no reason why a city can't buy those buildings, why they can't rezone an area, which might force them to sell or subsidize companies to buy these and encourage them to say, hey, we'll split some of the costs with you. There's tons and tons of options, and capitalism as the excuse really doesn't make any sense.
If North American cities would stop hiding behind this excuse, we could change gentrification into a positive thing. It's easy to say that it's just capitalism and gentrification will happen regardless. But the fact is that Leipzig proves that you can allow capitalism and gentrification without major impacts.
I guess ultimately what we are trying to answer in this video, what can Leipzig teach North America about gentrification? What North America and a lot of cities do need to do to make sure that they can do gentrification in a sustainable way is follow some of those lessons. Rebuild with a purpose, come up with a plan. Don't create excuses like capitalism. Don't put all kinds of red tape in the way. And you might actually help gentrify in all the right ways and allow a level of creative freedom. Like, look at these walls. Like, if you allow that creative freedom, you take away the red tape and all the rules and all the laws, you might actually end up with something amazing. People are very resourceful. They can do quite a bit. So guys, this is the third time in 3 days that I've actually been to this area. The first time I came by, just kind of exploring, looking around, and I kind of just scratched the surface of Plagwitz, and I knew there was something here. So I went home and I did a little bit of research, and I slowly came to understand that there was things like Graffiti Alley here, and I knew there could be a story to be told. So I knew I wanted to talk about gentrification and all these different things, but I didn't quite know how to frame it. So I came out here and I actually filmed the video, but I just didn't get it right. I needed to be able to wrap my head around the whole entire story. So I went home, thought about it, and I came back again today. The reason I tell you this is because I want to continue to tell stories like this. I think travel is a lot about not just seeing new things, it's also about learning and taking those things home with you. And so I want to continue to do these kinds of stories and create these kinds of videos. If you do like these kind of videos, I intend to continue making lots like this one, as well as my vlog style videos. You know, if you do want to continue to follow and you like them, consider subscribing, give me a like. Let me know that you do like them in the comments, because I can't really know unless somebody tells me. So until next time, we'll see ya.